this is the first Sunday in the new year. We're starting to look at the Gospel year of B, um, which includes the Gospel according to Mark. Now, Mark is a very different tone than Matthew. And one of the frustrating things about preaching on the very first Sunday of Advent is how much we've just covered. We've just gone through all of November looking at the apocryphal writings in Matthew, and now, bang, we're into the same writings, but in Mark. Mark has a different spin on it for sure, but it's the same general message. We know you're being oppressed, we know you're having a hard time, but God is hope. The future is coming. Just be aware, be alert, be ready. Wait, it's coming. I promise you, the hope is there. That's the message that comes. Now, Matthew tells it in the parable. Mark tells it in images because Mark is a much faster gospel. It moves through. In fact, it takes just over an hour to read the entirety of Mark in one setting. And I really encourage you to do that because with Mark, we get the opportunity to sit and watch how it all unfolds. One of the disappointments, I guess, I have preaching from week to week is that we only deal with a little snippet of the passage and we don't see it in its whole context. But Mark gives us the opportunity to actually spend some time doing that. And I think for the next little while, I'm going to be getting Matthew and Mark mixed up because we've just come out of the year of Matthew. Mark uses images. And one of the images he uses in the scripture we're looking at today is the image of the universe essentially imploding. And he compares it to the first story in Genesis of creation. Now, whether that's Mark's intent or not, or whether that's just happenstance, who knows? That answer's lost through history and maybe fancy. But what we have is Mark saying that at the end, the sun and the moon will stop shining. Whereas in the beginning, in Genesis, the sun and the moon were given their light. And one ruled the day and one ruled the nighttime. Mark talks about how the barriers of the waters will be removed and everything will be water chaos. In Genesis, it talked about how there was a divide between the waters in the sky and the waters on the land so that people could function. Now, of course, this is pre-science knowing what the universe looks like, but the images still mark the reality that the author of Mark is looking at ending the world that God has created, and then for it to become something else. But again, the warning is always there. Don't look for signs. Don't expect things. Horrible things are going to happen. There's going to be earthquakes, there's going to be devastation, there's going to be wars. None of that is going to stop. But all of it is leading up to the end time. And often you see people predicting, well, they know exactly what it's going to be. And just about every year has someone in the world predicting, not always Christianity, although we do have the majority of these folks, predicting when the world will end. And the scripture clearly says, do not get involved with that exercise. It is futile. That is not how it's going to come. Only God knows when that ending is going to come, and God's not letting anyone know. So live your life the way it is now. In Mark's world, so I guess I should situate Mark a little bit. Best the scholars can deduce is that Mark is the only gospel we have written before the destruction of the temple. So around 60 CE is when Mark's gospel was composed and shared for the first time. Those people were living very much under occupation. Nero had just kicked a bunch of the Jews, or the Hebrews rather, which they still considered themselves, out of Rome. There was incredible persecution. The Jesus followers were not making friends anywhere with the establishment because they were not supporting the more radical edges of militaristic Hebrew culture. They were kind of on the radical edges of equality culture. Those two don't go together very well. And they were talking about their ministry and what that was going to look like. So Mark is more contemporaneous with Paul than he is with Luke or Matthew, telling a very, very different story. And we're not sure exactly where Mark is situated. He is probably influenced by Greek because he doesn't always get every Hebrew meaning or procedure correct, but he tries. So that's kind of a little bit about what's going on. And Mark's gospel is fast, it's quick moving. You do not spend time with Mark just kind of lollygagging and indulging in thought exercises. Mark's not about that. It's get on with it, get going. So when we look at the four gospels, really, the way they kind of break down as far as method and appearance is that Matthew is that introspective, get your inner house in order. Mark is that social justice, get the world in order. John is a trial, essentially. There's no question in John about who Jesus is, the Messiah, flat up from the beginning. And then they go through a procedure of proving it, almost like an inquiry, I guess, more than a trial, proving that Jesus is the Messiah through various sayings and teachings and symbols and whatever else. Mark is a play. It's a Greek style of play, a biography play, which was very common in the era. Now, that does not mean it was necessarily historically censored the way we might do biographies today, looking for true stories based on rather than fanciful stories. We don't have that level of assessment, and that was not a question back in the day. A lot of what people considered histories or people's stories were intermingled fantasy and romantic versions and historic experiences and whatever. That was all mingled together. So there's no way to tease out what was what. But Mark's play is essentially 3 acts. We have, and scholars actually have referred to it as a gospel about the passion with a really long introduction. So our first act essentially is leading up from Mark 1 right up until Mark 13. 12, 13, depending on where you want to draw that line. And then we have 14 and 15 as the end of Mark. And then the third part of the play is actually on us. If you look at the Gospel of Mark and do open it to the back, you're going to see 3 endings. It's going to say short ending and then long ending. And the long ending is where you get that strangeness about handling snakes. No scholar that I had ever read can figure out where that came from or who inserted that, but it certainly was not part of the original scripture. You look at the other ending, not the short ending, but the other long ending, and it's very much what we see in Luke. So obviously the Lucan community, or people who had been familiar with the Gospel of Luke, were not happy with how open-ended Mark was. So they wrote back into it and added this last ending. But the original ending, the short ending, where the women kind of come and they run away afraid, is very much in keeping with some genres, some elements of Greek theater, which had the audience as part of the third act. That Act 1 is the setup, Act 2 is the crescendo, Act 3 is now for us to take the story and do something with it. So again, very specific genre writings from a time that is quite lost to us. There's no easy parallels in our society. So John is fast, getting through the narrative, moving to the next town and the next town, and the healing and the arguments with the authorities and the turning away of his family and the welcoming only the people who are in the inner circle. And secrets. Mark is full of secrets. The only people in Mark who recognize Jesus as Messiah are all the demons. And Jesus tells each of them, don't talk, don't say anything. Of course they do. But that's secrecy. It's not until Jesus is standing in front of Herod Antipas, I believe it is, might be someone else, admitting when they ask, are you the Messiah, are you the King of the Jews? Jesus says, I am. That's the first time in the entire Gospel of Mark that Jesus acknowledges that he is Messiah. Prior to that, it is all secrecy. So it's fast and it's secrets and it's get on board because we're moving, and it is meant to lay the story of why this man was worth following. When we had a host of other prophets who claimed to be the Messiah, what was it in all the secrecy that stood out to these folks? And Mark's main answer to that is a Jesus willing to suffer for us. This is not substitutionary atonement. where we had sins and Jesus suffered for us so we wouldn't have to. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking someone who acknowledged that to change the world, someone was going to have to stand up and risk their body, risk their lives to give the message that needs to happen, that so that we as followers, as the generations that come after, could understand the message of good news, the message of hope. So that's Mark, and it comes all the way back around to the first Sunday of Advent and what we're talking about. There's a reason why we begin the Christian year the same way we end the Christian year. Because no matter what happens, no matter which stories we encounter, no matter what bits of insight we're going to have along the road, hope is what keeps the circle going. And every year at this time, we start to prepare for hope. It takes the beautiful form of a baby. And that is why we're preparing this week. Next week, we're going to be looking at the people around Jesus in the beginning. But this week, we have an opportunity to kind of bridge between what we've just been talking about through November and what we now see as hope in the incarnation, the promise that Jesus comes, that we are going to experience this miracle again. And what are we going to learn from it this time around? What new insight are we going to get? This is our Happy New Year.